The rain against the penthouse glass didn't sound like weather. It sounded like static, a relentless interference in the quiet room. Inside, the air was heavy, thickened by the scent of expensive scotch and the sharp electric tang of ozone. I stood near the door, my hand hovering over the handle, every instinct screaming at me to run. Then Quinn's whisper cut through the silence, soft but devastatingly clear. "If you can't look at me, how will you ever finish this building?" The multi-million-dollar contract on the table behind us suddenly felt irrelevant. The stakes had shifted terrifyingly fast. This wasn't about architecture anymore. It was about the collapse of the emotional wall I had spent a lifetime reinforcing. I turned to leave, desperate for the safety of the elevator, but her reflection in the darkened window stopped me cold, a ghost I couldn't escape. To understand why I froze in that doorway, you have to understand the woman I was before Quinn Brady walked into my life. In the architectural world, I was known for one thing: absolute precision. My buildings were celebrated for their austere lines, their cold, unyielding perfection. I designed structures that kept the world out, fortresses of steel and glass where emotion couldn't find a foothold. I lived my life the same way. Clients were problems to be solved, variables to be managed, not people to be known. I kept them at arm's length, buried under blueprints and fee schedules, safe behind a barricade of professional detachment. Then came the commission for the Spire. It was supposed to be the crown jewel of the city skyline, a vanity project for Quinn Brady, a tech CEO whose reputation for ruthless efficiency rivaled my own. I expected a client who wanted height, dominance, a phallic monument to her own ego. I prepared a pitch that was sleek, defensive, and utterly impenetrable. Our first meeting was in my conference room, a space designed to intimidate, with its long marble table and floor-to-ceiling windows that reduced the city to a distant, silent backdrop. My team was nervous, checking their watches, adjusting perfectly aligned papers. Quinn was late. When the doors finally opened, she didn't apologize. She walked in, and the sterile, recycled air of the room seemed to shift, charging with a sudden, undeniable energy. She wasn't wearing the severe business suit I expected. She wore silk that moved like liquid, a softness that contradicted the sharp, predatory intelligence in her eyes. She didn't even glance at the portfolio I slid across the table. She didn't look at the renderings of the glass facade or the structural specs. She looked at me. Her gaze was unflinching, dissecting me with a terrifying precision that made me feel like a draft sketch being marked up for errors. "You build cages," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a diagnosis. I felt a flush of irritation rise up my neck, a crack in my composure. "I build sanctuaries, Ms. Brady, spaces that offer protection and order in a chaotic world." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the chaotic sprawl of the city below. "I don't need protection, and I certainly don't need order. I have enough of that in my code." She turned back to me, and the distance between us felt suddenly dangerously short. "I want this building to breathe. I want it to feel exposed." The word hung in the air. Exposed. It was everything I avoided in my work, everything I avoided in myself. I tried to steer the conversation back to logistics, to load-bearing walls and wind resistance, but Quinn wouldn't let me. She leaned over the table, her hands resting on the pristine surface, invading my personal space with a casual arrogance that made my pulse jump. I could smell her perfume now, sandalwood and something sharper, like rain on hot asphalt. "You're afraid of it," she murmured, her voice dropping an octave. "You design these beautiful, cold boxes because you're terrified of what might happen if you let the light in. You think control is the same thing as strength." It felt like a physical blow. Every critique she leveled at the building felt like a critique of my own guarded personality. She was tearing down my walls before we had even broken ground. I should have walked away then. I should have told her to find another architect, someone who specialized in vulnerable structures. But the challenge in her eyes was addictive. She was daring me to break my own rules. I pushed the contract toward her, my hand trembling slightly, a weakness I hoped she wouldn't notice. If you want exposure, I said, my voice tighter than I intended, it will cost you. Gwyn smiled then, a slow, knowing curve of her lips that suggested she knew exactly what the price would be. She signed the papers without breaking eye contact. The scratch of her pen against the paper sounded loud in the quiet room. It was a signature, yes, but as she capped the pen and slid the document back to me, it felt less like a business agreement and more like a surrender. I had signed on to build her tower, but I had no idea that the foundation we were laying was going to be built on the ruin of my own defenses. The site was a violent, open wound in the city's chest. I loved it here. Before the sleek glass skins and polished marble lobbies could exist, there was this, the raw, chaotic truth of excavation. The air tasted of wet cement, pulverized limestone, and the metallic tang of welding sparks. It was chaos I could control. The cacophony of jackhammers was a symphony I understood, noise that drowned out the quiet panic I carried. In my scuffed hard hat and steel-toed boots, I was the absolute authority. The blueprints rolled tight in my hand were the law. Then Quinn arrived. She stepped out of a black sedan that looked absurd against the backdrop of mud and twisted rebar. She wasn't wearing practical gear. She was draped in a trench coat that cost more than the heavy machinery idling nearby, her heels sharp enough to pierce the earth. But she didn't stumble. She moved through the debris with a terrifying, unnatural grace, like a queen walking through a battlefield she had ordered into existence. The workers stopped. The shouting died down. Even the machinery seemed to hesitate in deference. "It's dirty," I said, shouting over the sudden roar of a crane swinging a steel beam overhead. "You shouldn't be here." "It's my dirt," she countered, her voice cutting through the din without raising it. She stepped closer, ignoring the mud splattering the pristine hem of her coat. "Show me the bones." We walked the perimeter. I tried to keep the tour technical, pointing out the load-bearing columns and the depth of the pylons, but the site was treacherous, a living thing that didn't care about bank accounts or safety protocols. A sudden, ear-splitting screech of metal on metal made us both flinch. A pallet of rebar swung too wide, the cable groaning under the tension, the load swaying dangerously close to the walkway. It wasn't a disaster, but it was close enough to send a jolt of adrenaline through the site. "Move," I commanded, grabbing her arm. I pulled her toward the only shelter nearby, the temporary freight elevator used for materials. We stepped inside, the heavy metal grate rattling shut behind us, cutting off the worst of the noise. The silence inside the cage was sudden and absolute. The lift jerked upward, a slow, grinding ascent that vibrated through the soles of my boots. The space was cramped, smelling of hydraulic fluid, old grease, and the sudden, overwhelming scent of her. We were forced together, the proximity unavoidable. The air in the small box thickened instantly. I could feel the heat radiating from her, a physical weight that pressed against my side. I was still holding her arm. My fingers were digging into the expensive fabric of her coat. I let go as if I'd been burned, pulling my hand back to my side. But the sensation of her muscle tensing beneath my touch lingered on my skin like a brand. Quinn didn't move away. She turned to me, the harsh cage light casting sharp shadows across her face, making her eyes look darker, deeper. She looked at the raw concrete wall, passing slowly inches from our faces, then at me. "It looks strong," she said, her voice low, vibrating in the small space. "The foundation." "It has to be," I replied, my voice sounding too loud, too defensive in my own ears, to support the weight of what's coming. She turned her gaze fully to me. "And you?" she asked. "Are you strong enough for the weight?" "I don't crack," I said, the lie tasting like ash. Quinn stepped closer. There was nowhere for me to retreat. Her back was to the grate, the city moving past us in blurred slices. "Everyone cracks, architect. It's just a matter of where the pressure is applied." She reached out, not touching me, but tracing the air near my jawline, close enough that the fine hairs on my neck stood up. "The strongest structures are the ones that know how to bend. If you stay this rigid, you'll shatter." The elevator shuddered to a halt. The grate rattled open. The wind from the upper level hit us, cold and sharp, carrying the smell of the city and the coming rain. But the air between us remained heavy, charged with a heat that the wind couldn't touch. The days blurred into a rhythm of concrete and noise, but the nights belonged to the studio. My workspace, once a sanctuary of solitary confinement where I worshipped at the altar of geometry, had been breached. Quinn didn't just visit, she inhabited. She treated my drafting table like an extension of her own boardroom, invading the space with a terrifying sense of ownership that I found impossible to police. It became a ritual. The rest of the firm would leave, the lights in the main office flickering out one by one until only my corner studio remained, a glass box suspended above the city grid. I would be bent over the main elevation plans, eyes burning, the smell of graphite and eraser dust sharp in my nose. And then the change in air pressure. The soft click of the door. Quinn. She never announced herself. She would simply appear at the edge of my peripheral vision, a shadow that smelled of sandalwood and rain, overpowering the dry, sterile scent of paper. She wouldn't sit in the client chair. She would prowl. She touched the models, ran her fingers along the edges of the rulers, disrupted the careful order of my tools. "You're still trying to armor it," she said one night. It was past midnight. The city outside was a smear of wet neon, the rain from the site visit having turned into a week-long deluge. I didn't look up from the vellum. "I'm trying to make sure it stands up, Quinn. Gravity doesn't care about metaphors. Gravity is just another rule to be bent." She moved behind me then. I could feel the heat of her body radiating against my back, a few inches of empty space that felt more charged than actual contact. She leaned over my shoulder to look at the line I was drawing. A rigid, vertical support meant to anchor the atrium. Her hair brushed against my cheek, a silken, accidental caress that made my hand spasm around the pencil. The lead snapped. The sharp crack was loud in the quiet room. "You're tense," she observed, her voice right at my ear, low and humming with that same dangerous frequency I'd felt in the elevator. "I'm working," I replied, my voice tight. I reached for a new pencil, but her hand moved faster. She didn't take the pencil. She took my hand. Her skin was cool, her grip firm but not forceful. She wrapped her long fingers around mine, guiding my hand back to the paper. My breath hitched, a traitorous sound I couldn't suppress. The contact was electric, shocking in its intimacy. We were two professionals in a high-stakes industry, yet here we were, frozen in a tableau that felt less like architectural drafting and more like a seduction. "Not a straight line," she whispered. She guided my hand, forcing the pencil to move in a subtle, sweeping arc that defied the grid I had laid out. "Here, it needs to yield." I stared at the line we had drawn together. It was wrong. It was structurally aggressive, financially irresponsible, and completely beautiful. But I wasn't looking at the graphite. I was hyper-aware of her thumb resting against the pulse point of my wrist, pressing gently, as if she were taking a reading of my internal chaos. My heart was hammering against my ribs, like a bird trapped in the glass cage I had built. I should have pulled away. I should have cited professional boundaries, liability clauses, the lateness of the hour. But I didn't. I stayed there, trapped between the table and her body, letting her guide my hand, letting the scent of her fill my lungs until I was dizzy with it. "See," she said, her voice soft, satisfied. "It's better when you let go." She released me then, stepping back into the shadows. The loss of her touch was immediate and cold, leaving my skin stinging. I stared at the curved line on the paper, my chest heaving. "It's just a draft," I managed to say, my voice sounding wrecked. "I'll have the engineers review the load stress." "You do that," Quinn said, moving toward the door. She paused, looking back at me, her eyes catching the reflection of the city lights. But we both know the structure is sound. It's the architect I'm worried about. When the door clicked shut, I exhaled a breath I felt like I'd been holding for hours. I told myself this was just hands-on client management. I told myself she was eccentric, demanding, a visionary who needed to feel involved. I told myself the racing of my heart was just caffeine and sleep deprivation. I looked at the curved line again. The graphite shimmered under the lamp. The lines on the paper were straight, mostly. But the boundaries I had relied on for survival were blurring, dissolving into the gray areas I had spent my entire career avoiding. The grand hall was a cavern of polished marble and hollow laughter, a space designed to amplify wealth and dampen sincerity. It was the kind of room I usually hated, a place where architecture was reduced to a backdrop for social climbing. But tonight, the centerpiece wasn't the vaulted ceiling or the frescoed walls. It was the scale model of the spire, glowing softly under a dedicated spotlight in the center of the room. It looked innocent there, a pristine toy made of acrylic and light, stripped of the mud, the noise, and the sweat of the construction site. It looked manageable. I stood near a pillar, nursing a glass of champagne that had long since gone warm, watching the crowd circle the model like moths drawn to a very expensive flame. But they weren't really looking at the building. They were looking at Quinn. She moved through the crowd with the lethal efficiency of a shark in open water. She wore midnight blue velvet, a gown that clung to her frame like a second skin, cut dangerously low in the back. It was a calculated display of power. She was exposing herself, just as she wanted the building to be exposed. Yet she remained completely untouchable. I watched her charm a circle of investors, her head thrown back in a laugh that I knew was performative. It was a perfect facade. I knew the cracks in the foundation, the tension she carried in her shoulders, the way her breath hitched when she was truly challenged. But to this room, she was seamless. A sharp, hot spike of jealousy twisted in my gut. Not professional envy, but something darker, more possessive. I hated that they saw her brilliance, but didn't know the texture of her hands. I hated that I wanted to cross the room and shield her from their hungry eyes, even as I wanted to be the only one allowed to consume her. As if summoned by my thoughts, Quinn turned. Her gaze cut through the sea of black tuxedos and landed on me with the weight of a physical impact. She excused herself from the circle, leaving 3 billionaires mid-sentence, and walked straight toward me. The crowd seemed to part for her, drawn by the gravity she generated. "You're hiding," she said when she reached me. Her voice was low, sliding under the hum of the room. "I'm observing," I corrected, swirling the dead champagne, checking the structural integrity of the social hierarchy. "It's flimsy," she murmured, stepping into my personal space. She was too close for a professional colleague, close enough that the scent of her, that maddening sandalwood, drowned out the expensive perfumes of the gala. "Come with me. The board wants to meet the genius who finally got me to sign a contract." She didn't wait for an answer. She turned, and as she did, her hand found the small of my back. It wasn't a polite guide. It was a brand. Her palm was hot against the silk of my dress, her fingers splayed wide, pressing firmly against my spine. The contact burned. It was a possessive, grounding weight that claimed me in front of 300 of the city's elite. My breath caught, my carefully constructed composure fracturing under the heat of her touch. I let her guide me toward the investors, my legs moving on autopilot, my entire awareness focused on the imprint of her hand. "Gentlemen," Quinn said, her voice smooth, commanding, "this is the architect, the only person in this city who knows how to tell me no." The men laughed, polite and deferential. They asked about zoning, about timelines, about the glass selection. I answered with practiced precision, reciting the specs I knew by heart. But my mind was screaming. Quinn's hand hadn't moved. Her thumb was tracing slow, deliberate circles against my lower back, a secret rhythmic friction that was dismantling me piece by piece. One of the investors, a man with silver hair and a predatory smile, nodded at the model. "It's a bold design, Miss Brady. Very exposed. You're putting a lot of trust in one person's vision." Quinn's hand stopped moving. She tightened her grip, pulling me imperceptibly closer until our arms brushed. She looked at the man, but her words were aimed like a weapon at me. "I don't invest in buildings, Arthur," she said, her voice dropping to that dangerous, intimate register that made my knees weak. "I invest in people, and when I find something I want, I ensure I have total ownership." The double meaning hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She wasn't talking about the deeds of the land. She was looking at me, her eyes dark and unyielding, stripping away the last of my professional defenses. The air in the ballroom suddenly felt too thin, the lights too bright. I was drowning in the open, anchored only by her burning touch. "Excuse me," I managed to choke out. "I need air." I pulled away from her hand, a physical wrenching that felt like tearing skin, and turned blindly toward the terrace doors. I needed the cold. I needed distance. But as I pushed out into the night, I knew the truth. The cold air offered no relief. The heat wasn't in the room. It was in my blood, ignited by a woman who had just claimed me without signing a single document. The facade was gone. The structure was compromised. And God help me, I didn't want to rebuild it. The showroom was a windowless vault, a library of tactile potential where the air smelled faintly of cut cedar and treated leather. It was silent, insulated from the city's grind by thick walls and acoustic paneling. We were alone. My assistant had been dismissed hours ago, leaving just the two of us to navigate the final selections for the penthouse interiors. It should have been a simple task, choosing the skin that would cover the bones we were building. But with Quinn, nothing was ever just a surface. It was always a statement of intent. She moved through the aisles of stone slabs and wood veneers with a restless, predatory energy. She rejected the Carrara marble immediately. Too cold, she said, running a manicured nail down the white vein. It feels like a bank or a mausoleum. I don't want to live in a monument, architect. I want to live in a home. Stone endures, I argued, leaning against a display of granite. It doesn't fade. It doesn't yield. Exactly, she countered, turning to face me. It doesn't yield. It doesn't react to you. It just exists. She walked over to the textile section where bolts of silk, velvet, and mohair hung in heavy, colorful cascades. I want surfaces that remember you were there. Materials that hold heat. She stopped in front of a display of wall coverings. She didn't look at the price tags or the durability ratings. She looked at me, her eyes dark and unreadable in the gallery lighting. You choose with your eyes, she said softly. You look for symmetry, for clean lines. You don't know how to feel. I know the difference between velvet and linen, Quinn. Do you? She stepped closer, closing the distance until the air between us charged with that familiar, dangerous static. Prove it. She reached out and took my glasses off my face. The world blurred slightly, softening at the edges, but she remained in sharp, terrifying focus. She folded the frames and set them on a nearby table. Close your eyes. Quinn, we have a schedule. Close them. It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered with the soft, absolute authority she used in boardrooms. I hesitated, my heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. This was professional suicide. This was absolute madness. But the pull was undeniable, a gravity I couldn't fight. I let my eyelids flutter shut, plunging myself into a vulnerable, waiting darkness. Immediately, the dynamic shifted. Deprived of sight, my other senses flared into agonizing prominence. I could smell the sandalwood of her perfume, warmer now, mixed with the scent of the wool samples. I could hear the rustle of her silk blouse as she moved, the soft scuff of her heels on the polished floor. Give me your hand, she whispered. I reached out blindly. Her hand caught mine, her skin shockingly hot, her fingers interlocking with mine. She didn't pull, she guided. She lifted my hand and pressed it against the surface. Tell me, she murmured, her lips so close to my ear I could feel the warmth of her breath. It's rough, I stammered. My fingertips traced a coarse, heavy weave. Raw silk? No, heavy linen. It has friction. Resistance, she corrected. It pushes back. She moved my hand again. The transition was jarring. My fingers sank into something impossibly soft, deep, and yielding. It was a sensation so luxurious, so intimate, it felt almost obscene. And this? She asked. Her voice had dropped, a husky vibration that traveled straight down my spine. Velvet, I breathed. Mohair. It's warm. It yields, she whispered. It takes your shape. It welcomes the weight. She pressed my hand harder into the fabric, her palm covering the back of my hand, trapping me against the softness. I was paralyzed, caught between the sensory overload of the texture and the overwhelming reality of her body, just inches from mine. In the darkness, the boundaries of the showroom dissolved. There was only the heat of her hand, the slide of the velvet, and the sound of her breathing. Then I heard it, a small, sharp intake of air, a hitch in her breath. It was a sound of pure, unguarded want. My eyes flew open. Quinn was staring at me, her pupils blown wide, her face flushed. She didn't pull away. Her hand was still pressing mine into the velvet, grounding us both in the confession we hadn't spoken. The choice of materials wasn't about the building anymore. It was about us. It was a declaration of how she wanted to be touched, with friction, with heat, with a yielding that terrified me. "We'll take the velvet," she said, her voice steady, though her pulse was visible in her throat. "Yes," I whispered, my voice failing me. "The velvet." The report lay on the desk like a declaration of war. The red ink circled the lateral bracing of the upper atrium, the heart of the exposed design. The wind tunnel simulations had failed spectacularly. Under the stress of a 100-year storm, the glass curtain wall wouldn't just crack, it would shear off the frame. The sky outside had turned a bruised, violent purple. The storm wasn't just a theoretical model on paper anymore. It was hammering against the corrugated roof of the site office with the force of an artillery barrage. We were trapped. The roads to the site were flooded, the cranes were locked down, and the crew had been sent home. It was just the two of us in the prefab trailer, surrounded by blueprints and the smell of rising panic. I was pacing the narrow length of the room, shouting into a cell phone that had lost its signal 10 minutes ago. I felt the familiar, cold armor of professionalism sliding into place. I desperately needed a solution. I needed a redesign. I needed to retreat into the cold, hard math, where I was safe. Quinn sat on the edge of the cluttered desk, watching me unravel. She sat uncharacteristically still, tracking my frantic movements like a predator watching prey. "We have to thicken the trusses," I snapped, throwing the dead phone onto a pile of safety vests. "If we don't reinforce the west elevation, the torque will snap the glazing. I told you, Quinn. I told you this design was too vulnerable. I told you we needed more steel." "It's not the steel," she said, her voice calm, cutting through the noise of the rain. "It is the steel. It's the physics. You wanted a building that breathes? Well, right now it's going to suffocate." I slammed my hand onto the desk. "My name is on this, Quinn. If this fails, I don't just lose a client. I lose everything." Then the world ended. Or at least, the power did. The overhead fluorescence died with a sharp pop, plunging us into a heavy gloom illuminated only by jagged lightning. The hum of the servers vanished. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only by the relentless drumming of the rain and the ragged sound of my own breathing. "Sit down," Quinn commanded. Her voice came from the shadows, low and vibrating with an intensity that had nothing to do with architecture. "I can't sit down. I have to fix this. I need a flashlight. You can't fix a storm, architect." I heard her slide off the desk. She moved toward me in the dark, a presence I could feel before I could see. "Stop trying to engineer a solution for something that just needs to be weathered." "This isn't a metaphor," I yelled, the frustration finally shattering my control. "I am trying to protect you. I am trying to keep the roof over your head from collapsing." "I never asked for your protection." Her shout cracked the air, louder than the thunder. "I asked for you. You're retreating again. You hit a snag and you run back to your calculations. You hide behind the work." "I am trying to save the building. I don't care about the building." The words hung in the electrified air, shocking in their blasphemy. Quinn Brady, who had micromanaged every inch of this project, who had obsessed over the texture of the velvet and the temperature of the stone, was lying. "You don't mean that," I whispered. "I do," she breathed. She was right in front of me now. A flash of lightning illuminated her face, pale, fierce, and terrifyingly open. "Let the timeline slip. Let the budget bleed. I don't care if the opening is delayed a year. I care that every time things get difficult, you turn into stone. You shut me out." She reached out, her hand finding my arm in the dark. Her grip was tight, bruising. "I don't need a fortress, and I don't need a savior. I need to know if you're in this room with me, or if you're already gone." The storm outside was tearing at the city, ripping branches from trees and flooding the streets. But it was nothing compared to the pressure building inside that small, dark room. The storm in the trailer had been a chaotic, external force. But the silence in Quinn's penthouse 3 days later was a different kind of violence entirely. It was a vacuum, waiting to be filled, heavy with the weight of everything we hadn't said in the dark. I had spent 72 hours dodging her calls, burying myself in structural addendums and liability reports, desperately trying to rebuild the professional wall she had smashed through. But a summons to the penthouse wasn't something the architect of record could ignore. The elevator opened directly into the space. It was a glass box floating in the sky, dimly lit and smelling of expensive leather, old books, and the ozone of the lingering weather system. The city below was a sprawling grid of amber and white, but inside, the atmosphere was distinctly predatory. It felt like walking into a lion's den where the lion was already bored of the hunt. Quinn stood by the wet bar, her silhouette cut sharp against the panoramic window. She didn't turn when the doors slid shut. She just continued pouring, the sound of amber liquid hitting crystal echoing like a gavel strike in the quiet room. "You're late," she said, her voice devoid of the heat she'd shown in the trailer. It was cool, detached. A return to the CEO persona I had designed this building for. "I was reviewing the wind shear data," I lied, stepping further into the room but keeping my distance. I stayed near the entryway, treating the edge of the Persian rug like a boundary line I couldn't cross. "The revised specs for the atrium are ready for your signature." "Leave the specs," she commanded, finally turning. She held 2 glasses. She walked toward me, moving with that lethal grace, not stopping until she was well inside my personal zone. She forced me to hold my ground or retreat into the elevator. I didn't retreat. I froze, rooted to the spot by a mixture of panic and desire. She held out a glass, the amber liquid catching the low light. "Drink." I took the glass, our fingers brushing, a momentary short circuit that sent a jolt up my arm. "Quinn, we need to discuss the timeline. The delay—" "Stop." She took a slow sip, her eyes tracking the nervous flutter of my pulse in my throat. "You've been avoiding me since the blackout. You're treating me like a structural flaw you can engineer your way around." I turned away from her, focusing on the dark expanse of the window. I could see our reflections there, 2 ghosts suspended over the city lights. "I am trying to maintain professional standards," I said to the glass. "I am trying to finish your building. Are you?" She moved into my peripheral vision. She didn't touch me, but I could feel the heat radiating from her skin, a magnetic pull that made my knees weak. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're running away. You build these walls, architect. You build them so high and so thick that you think you're safe. But you're not safe. You're just alone." I gripped the glass tighter, watching the reflection of her hand rising. She reached out, her fingers grazing my jawline, tilting my head. I resisted. I kept my eyes locked on the reflection, on the safety of the indirect image. If I looked at the real thing, if I looked at the raw need in her eyes, the contract would burn. She leaned in, her lips brushing the shell of my ear, her voice dropping to a whisper that wrecked me. "If you can't look at me, how will you ever finish this building?" The question severed the last cable holding me up. The reflection in the window mocked me, a coward staring at a ghost. The spire wasn't just steel and glass. It was this. It was the terror of being seen. I realized I couldn't build a monument to exposure while hiding in the dark. I stopped looking at the window. I took a breath that tasted of sandalwood and rain. I turned. I faced her directly. The impact was immediate, a collision of gravity. Her eyes were wide, dark, and terrifyingly open. There was no judgment there, only an invitation to fall. The professional distance didn't just collapse, it incinerated. I set the glass down on a nearby table, the sound sharp and final. "I see you," I whispered. I reached out, my hands finding her waist, pulling her against me. The contact was electric, a grounding wire finally finding earth. Quinn made a sound, half gasp, half sob, and her hands tangled in my hair, pulling me down. The blueprints were forgotten. The architecture of us took over. Wild, unpermitted, and structurally unsound. The morning light was a harsh clinical gray that stripped away the golden haze of the night before, revealing the stark reality of what I had done. I woke up alone. The sheets beside me were cold, though they still held the indentation of her body and the lingering scent of sandalwood. Panic hit me with the force of a structural failure. I sat up, heart hammering, looking around the silent penthouse. The sanctuary of the night became a trap in the cold light of day. I had crossed the one line that keeps the architecture world standing: client and architect. It was a breach of ethics so profound it could cost me my license, my reputation, and the identity I had spent a decade building. I didn't wait for coffee or to see if she was in the shower. I dressed with the frantic efficiency of a thief, finding my blouse under a chair, my shoes by the door. I escaped. The elevator ride, a nausea-inducing descent into the cold, hard reality I had tried to escape. For 2 weeks, I retreated into the only thing I knew how to control: bureaucracy. I became a ghost in my own firm, burying myself behind mountains of sterile paperwork. I reviewed supply chain manifests for door hinges. I audited the electrical subcontractors' hours down to the fraction of a minute. I obsessed over the mundane details because numbers didn't whisper. Numbers didn't look at you with dark, knowing eyes and ask you to yield. Quinn called. Of course she called. Her name on my screen was a recurring accusation: Quinn Brady. The vibration of the phone on the mahogany desk sounded like a drill. I watched it ring. Once, twice, a dozen times, my hand hovering over it, trembling. I wanted to answer. God, I wanted to answer. But the fear was paralyzing. I told my assistant I was in deep focus mode. I told the site foreman to handle walkthroughs without me. I built a wall of silence, brick by brick, thinking that if I stayed behind it, the fire in my blood would burn itself out. But fire consumes oxygen. Without Quinn, the project began to suffocate. The spire was in its final phase, the stretch where a structure gains its soul. It needed intuition. It needed touch. I was giving it only math. Contractors called with questions about light fixtures or wall textures, and I gave safe answers. Stick to the spec, I'd say, my voice flat. Don't deviate. I went to the site late one Tuesday, ensuring the crew had left so I wouldn't risk seeing her. The building was nearly complete. The glass curtain wall was sealed, the HVAC hummed, the polished concrete floors gleamed. It was technically flawless. It was the most precise structure I had ever designed, and it was dead. I walked through the main atrium, footsteps echoing too loudly in the empty space. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was an indictment. The air was sterile, feeling like a bank vault. There was no warmth, no friction, no life, just the echo of wasted potential. I reached out and touched the cold steel of a support column. It felt unyielding. It felt exactly like me. I stood in the heavy silence and realized Quinn had been right. The precision I prized, the austere lines I worshipped, they weren't strength. They were a cage. I had built a beautiful, multi-million-dollar prison to keep the world at a distance. I thought by removing variables, by controlling chaos, I was creating perfection. But perfection is static. Perfection is a flat line. I looked up at the glass ceiling where the city lights bled through in a chaotic, beautiful smear. I didn't need more control. I needed the storm. I needed the mess. I needed the woman who had forced me to close my eyes and feel. The building wasn't waiting for furniture. It was waiting for a heartbeat to make it real. It wasn't about finishing the building anymore. It was about filling it. The lobby of the spire was a canyon of light and noise, a sensory assault of 300 guests, the blinding pop of press flashbulbs, and the clinking of crystal. It was the culmination of a year of war and passion, distilled into a black tie event. To the board, this was a victory lap. To me, it felt like a trial. I stood at the podium, the heat of the stage lights pressing against my skin, a stack of index cards in my hand filled with safe, approved talking points about tensile strength and wind shear coefficients. I looked out at the sea of expectant faces, searching for the one pair of eyes that truly mattered. I found her near the back, standing in the shadow of a structural column. Quinn. She wore emerald silk that caught the light like deep water, her arms crossed, her expression guarded. She looked like a stranger again, the client, the CEO, the untouchable force I had met in that boardroom months ago. Seeing her there, watching me with that cool detachment, I felt the familiar panic of the elevator ride, the urge to retreat into the safety of the blueprint. But then I looked down at my cards, at the precise, hollow words I had written about geometry and physics, and I realized I couldn't do it. I couldn't talk about this building as if it were just steel and glass. It wasn't. It was a confession written in the skyline. I folded the cards and set them on the lectern. The microphone whined softly, a sharp feedback sound that silenced the room. "We are taught," I began, my voice echoing in the vaulted space, "that structure is about resistance. We build to withstand the wind, to repel the rain, to hold our ground against gravity." I looked directly at Quinn, ignoring the hundreds of people between us. But I have learned that the strongest structures aren't the ones that stand alone. They're the ones that dare to be vulnerable. This building isn't about height or dominance. It's about the courage to let the light in, even when you're terrified of what it might illuminate. A ripple of confused silence went through the room. Architects don't talk about feelings. We talk about load-bearing walls. But Quinn didn't look confused. Her arms uncrossed, her chin lifted. She heard the code. "To build something real," I finished, my voice shaking slightly, "you have to trust the fall. You have to admit that the foundation is meaningless if there is no one to share the shelter." I didn't stay for the applause. I handed the microphone to the mayor and slipped out the side exit, heading for the private elevator. I watched the floor numbers climb, 50, 60, 70, my heart racing faster than the ascent. The observation deck was empty, the air up here thin and cold, whipping around the glass parapet. The city was a carpet of diamonds, spread out 1,000 feet below, infinite and bright. Quinn was standing at the edge, her hands resting on the railing, looking out at the chaos we had risen above. She didn't turn when the door opened, but I saw the tension in her shoulders drop. "That was quite a speech," she said to the wind. "The board will be terrified. You sounded emotional." "Let them be terrified," I said, walking toward her. I didn't stop at the safe distance this time. I walked until I was standing right beside her, shoulder to shoulder, the heat of her body warring with the chill of the wind. "I'm done with safe designs, Quinn, and I'm done with empty rooms." She turned then, her eyes searching mine, looking for the cracks, for the hesitation. "And the architect? Is she still hiding behind the math?" "No," I said, reaching out to take her hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was instant and fierce. "The math was a lie. The only thing that matters is who you're standing with when the storm hits." Quinn let out a breath that sounded like a broken seal. She stepped in, erasing the space between us, her forehead resting against mine. "I thought you were gone," she whispered, the vulnerability finally cracking her voice. "I thought I'd scared you away with the truth." "You did," I admitted, running my thumb along her cheekbone, grounding myself in the reality of her skin. "But I came back, because this building, it doesn't work without you, and neither do I." We stood there as the party raged on, 70 floors below. Two women suspended in the sky, anchored only by each other. We weren't client and architect anymore. We were the foundation. The glass reflected us back, not as ghosts, but as solid, messy, beautiful reality. The elevator doors hissed shut, cutting off the distant hum of the gala and leaving us in the quiet sanctity of the space we had built together. The spire was finished, but the real work, the messy, unscripted architecture of a life together, was just beginning. Some structures are built to protect, others to expose. We had finally built one that did both. If you've built walls just to see who would care enough to tear them down, subscribe for more stories.